Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, June 13th, 2017. That means it's primary day here in Virginia. I gotta go vote. Hold on, I'll be right back. I need sound effects of me running out the door, opening the door, slamming the door, walking down the stairs, getting in the car. Actually, I think I'm going to walk to my polling place. Although I really need to check, I guess, for the primaries. It's not always the same polling place as we find in the general elections. But I'll figure that out. I've got until 7 p.m. tonight. I believe polls opened at 6 a.m. They close at about 7 p.m. here in Virginia. I better check that and make sure it's not 6 p.m. But I don't plan to wait that long. I plan to do it pretty much after the show. Maybe I'll get some lunch. You all want to meet? Maybe can you bring lunch? Can you eat in a voting booth? You can't take pictures there. I know that. Can you eat? Is it okay to do that? I'll have to figure out exactly what I'm going to do. I think I've made up my mind more or less, but I haven't paid enough attention to the contest for lieutenant governor. And so I got all the mail yesterday. All the mail came, and everybody mailed me about why I should vote for them, which is fantastic. And I will say this, Democrats in Virginia have a pretty good situation. There aren't any really terrible candidates. There's nobody I would be disappointed in, even if they won the nomination. And that's a fantastic thing. That is good news. Let's see. The lieutenant governor's race has been a little quieter, I guess. But, we'll see what we want to do. I got 2 mailers in the last couple of days from candidates. I'll have to figure out exactly what I'm going to do about those things. Maybe we'll chat about that a little bit because at the moment there's many other things to turn our attention to. You know how it is here these days under the Trump so-called administration. Just too much to figure out and keep up with from hour to hour, day to day, hour to hour, week to week, hour to hour. I'm singing Doors songs. That's how confused they've got me going on here. Let's see. Everything seems to be on the up and up so far. Apologies if there were interruptions in the signal. I didn't get a note from Justice yesterday that we dropped our signal at any point, but I did get complaints from 1 or 2 listeners who said that they had lost the signal. Of course, that could happen on your end as well, this being internet radio. But hopefully everything was good and strong and robust for the rest of you. And, of course, the podcast was available relatively quickly, so anything that you may have missed due to internet gremlins, you would hopefully have heard later on the podcast. We are on a Tuesday today. That means we are without Greg Dworkin, though Greg has many contributions to make to the show. He's already sent a couple of notes and a couple of articles and a couple of links that we'll have to take a look at. Where do you want to start today? Justice is letting me know in the background, of course, that everything is working well here today, but, his usual joking notes say, let's say the interlude, the music that we play in between our placeholder music and our show open. Interlude says, how can it be an open session if he pleads the fifth? Yeah, Jeff Sessions will be before who today? One of the Senate panels, and I haven't kept up to date on exactly what he's doing. It's gone back and forth between his refusing to testify publicly and then agreeing to testify publicly, but he may come and give non-committal answers or may even invoke the Fifth Amendment at some point. Of course, we also have looming in the background the other hot rumor of the day. As Justice puts it, our intro music says, Mueller is on report before he gets fired. I guess that's the big one of the day, right? The rumor of whether or not Trump has got the gall, essentially, to fire Robert Mueller as special counsel in this investigation. Oliver Stone also rates a mention here. And Justice says everything was good and strong signal-wise here. So those of you who lost our signal yesterday, check your internet and change providers or something like that. Or petition your local radio station to put us on the air and pay us lots of money to do it, too. That would be fantastic. We got to work that whole deal out. and see if we can get people to pay us tons and tons of money so we can pass it around. I like to trickle down, even though no one else does. For some reason, that's not working. We got to catch up on that story, too. Where do we start with all this stuff? Let's start with the Bob Mueller stuff just first, because, I don't know, something has to be first. I don't know what this means. I know it means trouble if he does it. I just don't know whether he's serious. I don't know whether this is trolling. Originally, I think the first mention I saw of the idea came when, who is it? The Newsmax guy? Chris Ruddy is a friend of Donald Trump's and keeps turning up in his presence in various locations and settings. And usually when the two of them get together and meet, something offensive and dumb is floated at some point, and it may just be that. It may just be Chris Ruddy trying to rile people up and get liberals mad by floating the idea that he would that Trump would fire the special counsel. But with Trump, you never know, because sometimes he does take the advice of these dumb people to do things that would rile people up. And as we discussed briefly yesterday with Greg, sometimes Trump does things not because he even particularly thinks they're good ideas, but because he knows that, or has been advised that, they will rile up the base of his opposition and make them angry and see red. And perhaps, I don't know whether he thinks he's going to provoke mistakes of some kind or overreaching of some kind from the forces of the opposition, the resistance, or whether he just thinks that riling them up will likewise rile his own base in opposition to their opposition, which is a real thing in today's setting. Can he do it? Yeah, he can, technically. And I've got a couple of articles, some of which were sent to me by Greg, some of which were found during my morning Twitter culling, that will explain the dynamics and difficulties of how it's done. At this point, speculating on exactly how it gets done, well, you'll see. It gets us into a place where we begin to start having to guess at what happens in stage 2, and then things begin to get messy, because if there's one or two options at the outset, and then each of the two options has with it 3 or 4 possible permutations in 2 or 3 steps, you very quickly balloon into, well, how many scenarios are there really? For the purposes of, let's move forward this way. I've got this piece here that I saw from at least 2 sources, the easiest of which is the fact that Greg sent it to me this morning. Thanks, Greg, for watching out for us on this one. Jack Goldsmith at the Lawfare blog. We have been back there a number of times. And I guess I should also point out along the way, I will, Armando will, if I don't, I'm sure, that Lawfare is populated by people they're sharp people. They know what they're talking about. They're excellent for referring to, particularly on procedure and legal foundations. They're not progressive heroes by any stretch of the imagination. They're all relatively conservative, and some of them are decidedly conservative. Some of them do consider themselves Democrats, some of the other writers. The lead bloggers lean more conservative than, typically speaking, our listening audience. But that doesn't mean that they're useless to us, of course. They're very instructive. And it also, of course, I guess it adds the dynamic of even the conservative so-and-so is saying blah, blah, blah. Not hard to find in the legal community when it comes to questions like this one. So here's his speculation on it, admittedly rushed. You'll see right in the text. Jack Goldsmith writing here, if Trump fires Mueller or orders his firing. I'm still not going with the Mueller thing, that pronunciation. That I don't know. A German speaker will have to tell me whether that makes sense for us to use, but I'm willing to believe it's not Mueller and go with Mueller, but Mueller I have my doubts about. Oh, and by the way, I need to get to, before I start on this thing, I forgot almost about what I put in the Morning Post. I have to get to the real business, the refrigerator. I know you're all anxious to find out, can the president, who might not really be the president because Russian meddling and hacking, etc., really fire the people who are investigating him and thus perpetuate himself in office as an autocrat and possible fascist dictator? Yes, blah, blah, blah. The refrigerator is what you came to hear about. And I won't keep you waiting. Yes, I will. No, I won't, as a matter of fact. The refrigerator is working. Hallelujah. It is finally repaired. The compressor was replaced. One small complaint I have about the repair, and I won't tell you who did the repair because I don't think that's fair. I mean, they did a great, I should tell you. It won't make any difference to you. They did a great job. The repair guy we had was the only professional involved in coming to our house. We finally did have good help from the people at Lowe's. So now we'll have to see whether they'll reimburse us for the $100 we spent in ice to keep our food preserved during all this time. But the refrigerator is repaired. The only complaint I have is that the guy left in a hurry because he wanted to provide competent and professional service to another person who needed his help, I'm sure. Left in a big hurry, and ordinarily, they haul away the old parts. So I have a bad LG refrigerator compressor sitting in a box, and that's like a 25, 30 pound piece of garbage. I'm not certain how I can get rid of this, and who knows what's inside and what's the environmentally sound way of disposing of a refrigerator compressor. I'll have to try and look that up. But in the meantime, it makes for a hell of a paperweight if you have like 650 pounds worth of paper, which, for the bottom half of the stack serves as its own paperweight. But I'll have a very attractive industrial looking doorstop I could use. If anyone would like it, and can haul it away, let me know. That's the big news here at Kagro in the Morning World headquarters. There's other news, as Bill lets us know from Portland, Maine, reminding us, as we saw this morning, the NBA finals are over. I did watch a good portion of last night's final game. It was terrific. I have to show it to my son, who's a basketball player, and should have been able to watch it, but he was busy playing Minecraft, because big news, he got on the server that he really wanted to play on yesterday. Exciting stuff, but good game last night, and turns out the Golden State Warriors, victors in last night's final game, which means, of course, that they won the championship. Didn't mean to blow it for anybody. Spoiler alerts. I don't think anybody really TiVos the last game of the NBA finals for purposes of finding out who won. But they did win, and they are not interested, believe it or not, in visiting Donald Trump at the White House. And this is, I guess this is the second of these sorts of controversies. There was mixed reaction among the New England Patriots for showing up at the White House. There's been a couple other sports teams that have, not professional, I don't think, but other championship, amateur, and college level teams that have had difficulties swallowing the idea of visiting Donald Trump at the White House. There will be complaints, stay in your lane, just do the sports thing, you should show up so you don't get fined kind of thing. But I guess as a team, they decided not to go and visit the White House. Donald Trump, unpopular and weak. That's the order of the day. I was going to say hated, but I decided unpopular was probably, more, I don't know what, more mature, and maybe even more damaging. I don't know. Somehow hated would make him think they're haters and losers, so I don't have to listen to them. But unpopular and weak certainly describes exactly what's going on. I'm glad they won't be going, and you should be too. All right. Now, getting back to the news of the day, the Lawfare article from Jack Goldsmith, if Trump fires Mueller or orders his firing. This is a tough piece to dive in with, and we could be setting the context elsewhere, but I sense that Armando wants to know immediately. What do they have to say? He hasn't said as much, but let's get right to the tough stuff. There are growing indications that President Trump, and I know we all choke on that phrase, may be thinking about getting rid of special counsel Robert Mueller. Again, caution, growing indications means it's being discussed in circles wherein, how should we put this? It would not be unusual for the participants in those discussions to merely be trolling, essentially. It's entirely possible that that's all nonsense, and the president is either not considering it or he was advised to throw it out there as a possibility in private discussion so that it could leak to the press that people were counseling him either for or against it. I don't know why he thinks that benefits him. And all of that could be untrue as well. But suffice to say, it's been injected into the bloodstream that somehow, rumor has it, that the president has considered this. Last weekend, the article continues, one of the president's private lawyers would not rule out the possibility when asked. I think we're talking about, what's-his-face, who made the statement at the National Press Club following the Comey testimony. Isn't that the case? Let's see if I'll click through and make sure that we have the... No, actually it wasn't. Now that I look at it, but I think that's come up as well. When they said one of the president's private attorneys, I thought, is that how they're referring to what is his name again? I can't even remember what the guy's name is who was making Kasowitz. That's it, Mark Kasowitz. But this is in fact, and I didn't really realize that he was a private attorney for Donald Trump, but what are we talking about here? Jay Sekulow, who's, a talking head lawyer, essentially, a talking head, conservative, quote unquote, I guess, conservative activist attorney. What role does he play with Donald Trump? I'm not really sure, but apparently they're referring to Sekulow having told George Stephanopoulos on Sunday on his program. Which one is that? It's This Week. Is that right? Yeah, This Week that Stephanopoulos hosts, saying he won't rule it out. That is, asked whether the president would pledge not to interfere on the order of or order the Attorney General to fire Mueller. He had this to say: look, the President of the United States, as we all know, is a unitary executive, and he is quite a unit at that. We know that. He doesn't, not saying he has one, although he says he does, and he liked to tell everybody on primetime television. But anyway, he's a unitary executive. That's sort of, that doesn't really say anything, but okay, a misapplication of the term. But the president is going to seek the advice of his counsel and inside the government as well as outside, and I'm not going to speculate on what he will or will not do. Sekulow said he can't imagine the issue would arise, but that again, it is an issue that the president with his advisors would discuss if there was a basis. So that's an overblown headline, and to attribute to Jay Sekulow that he was holding out the possibility that could happen is only minimally accurate. It's accurate enough to go ahead with and not get, sued or get yourself in trouble, but it's clearly not the tenor of his remarks. But it's your responsibility to read past the headline, and mine too. So I'm glad we did and figured that out. So back to Jack Goldsmith here. And again, I'm glad I took that diversion because, again, it puts in context. It reiterates that the context here is that people with unknown motives and unknown understandings of the mechanics and the politics involved in something like this are the ones doing this speculating. And most of the speculation about the speculation comes from the position initially that they really, really, really think the president is not thinking of doing this, even though the president is Trump. And you may dispute that. Very few people think that even he is dumb enough to do that. Oh, by the way, Justice offers me this German pronunciation guide. He says it is Mueller, and the UE should be pronounced as an umlaut. Do we include the E to indicate that we aren't using umlauts? Is that an anglicization? If it was just M-U umlaut L-L-E-R, we would say Mueller. So we should put the E in front, Mueller, because it makes it look like Mueller, really. But okay. Or if you're a Spanish speaker, I guess would we say Muellar or Muellar? I don't know. Anyway, who cares? Mueller is what I'm going to go with because I did open it up to German speakers. So the Germans would say Mueller. Interesting. And I don't know where we get Mueller from, but I recall that I didn't trust the source. It wasn't Greg. Greg just pointed me to another source. I trust Greg. I don't trust the person he pointed me to. Mueller. Mueller, that's anglicized. All right. Well, I'm going to stick with Mueller because I'm Anglish. Whatever that means. Okay. Let's get on to the news, please. Stop getting distracted. Okay, where were we? With Jack Goldsmith here. Yesterday, the president's allies started talking affirmatively about the possibility. Newt Gingrich, for example, said it was time to rethink the Mueller appointment, which looked increasingly bad for the president. I'll, again, sideline myself here just to say, one, Newt Gingrich rarely knows what he's talking about when it's somebody else's politics. He's not that good at reading other people's politics, I don't think, particularly this guy, Trump's. And he's been trying to insinuate himself into Trump world since forever, and he's not done a very good job of it. I guess the more salient observation would be something I saw someone make yesterday. Katie Tour, as a matter of fact, tweeting this yesterday. I had to retweet this one. She asked, does Newt not know that we can see his old tweets? I inserted not there. Does Newt know we can see his old tweets? Because there's a little bit of a problem. Which order I'll use the order she put it in. His tweet on the Robert Mueller selection dated May 17th. That would probably be the day of his selection, was Robert Mueller is a superb choice to be special counsel. His reputation is impeccable for honesty and integrity. That should be his reputation for honesty and integrity is impeccable, but it's not. What he wrote, media should now calm down. He's also going to give instructions to the media as to how to react. I think they were pretty happy with the appointment. I don't know what they need to calm down for. But here on May 17th, Gingrich has nothing but good things to tweet about Robert Mueller. The tune has changed, though. In his June 12th tweet yesterday at 4:34 a.m., allegedly, you're up too early, Newt, was Republicans are delusional if they think the special counsel is going to be fair. Look who he is hiring. Check FEC reports. Time to rethink. So either Newt Gingrich was caught flat-footed and was incredibly stupid about the appointment less than a month ago, or, like most Republicans, he's simply changing his stripes as necessary, and in order to stay on the inside in Trump world, you got to suck up. And I guess the orders went out that I'm not certain. And this indicates to me that the word went forth, maybe not from Trump himself, but from somebody inside the White House, that the president is mulling the firing of Mueller. I guess we must have seen that pun used before by now. But the president's thinking it over, and if you could offer your support and help soften up the media and public atmosphere for something like this, get his base prepared for it, call his integrity into question in the press, lay the groundwork, then it would be much easier for him to go ahead and do it, but it's not a done deal that he will. I mean, either way, it's good for Republicans if we soften up the public and the press on Mueller and sully his reputation somewhat. But if out of the goodness of Mr. Trump's heart, he should instead decide to allow Mr. Mueller to proceed with his investigation out of an abiding sense of fairness, you see, then, people will be able to take his conclusions with the proper sized grain of salt. And so it's win-win for them to be attacking Mueller. Anyway, so let's see. Back to our article with Goldsmith. That was Newt Gingrich's comment about it, as hypocritical as that seems. Ann Coulter, who we also think is a disgusting hypocrite and an idiot, said that Trump should fire Mueller. I say he should fire Mueller, too, only in the sense that I think that would just be Armageddon in Washington and whatever. I'm worried about it because the speculation, of course, and you'll see it in this article, and you will have seen it by now. It's no surprise to you that there are many people who say, well, if he fires Mueller, that's it. I mean, he loses all of his support in Congress. They'll immediately, let's see, we've seen, I think, Adam Schiff saying, well, if he did that, you'd immediately see the Congress reauthorize the independent counsel statute. And you'd just have a Ken Starr-style independent counsel investigating rather than special counsel under this Justice Department regulation. We would insulate whoever we appoint to the job. And you might even see Robert Mueller appointed to that job. In other words, you would see, Schiff says, a groundswell of resistance and a sea change, to mix our metaphors, in how the president is protected among Republican ranks in Congress. They would be fed up and they would absolutely not stand for it. But you're also seeing lots of pushback, and I gotta say my sympathies are with the pushback people. Congress is, for the most part, the Republicans in Congress are in this for the tax cuts and getting those, and I guess some of them repeal of health care, of the Affordable Care Act, and they want to see that cemented and signed. The weak part of that argument, of course, is that there's no reason in the world to believe that Mike Pence wouldn't sign that legislation, nor is there any reason to believe that President Orrin Hatch, if you finally simply impeach everybody and bypass Paul Ryan somehow, there's very little reason to believe that legislation wouldn't be signed, so that really can't be it either. It's just that they've hitched their wagon to Trump and the Republican Party, and it's embarrassing, and they've been told that until the job is done, they just have to stick with Trump. So I find it hard to believe that there would be this major and instantaneous revolt. It's not hard to believe that it would eventually come to that, but probably not until they got their legislation signed. Even though, reminder, the president doesn't need to sign the legislation in order for it to become law. But you know what we mean. It just doesn't, it has to not be vetoed. That's what they're worried about. Okay, or what they should be worried about. And then, back to Jack Goldsmith, and then Trump's friend Chris Ruddy, there we are, told Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour, I think he's considering perhaps terminating the special counsel. I think he's weighing that option. Who knows how Trump weighs anything? I imagine over a bag of Doritos or Lay's. I think Lay's potato chips are his actual favorites. Leading me to tweet yesterday that, probably among the decisions he's contemplating are firing the special counsel and nationalizing Frito-Lay. Two things high on his agenda. This seems like such a bad idea, firing the special counsel, says Jack Goldsmith, for the nation and for the president, that I have a hard time believing it's a live possibility. And I think we all do. We'd be aghast at it. But again, with Trump, because it's a terrible idea, we now have to consider the possibility that he's really thinking about it. Whether that's because his judgment is so bad or because, again, somewhere, someone in that White House actually operates on the principle that if liberals think it's a terrible idea, or even establishment Republicans, and best if both, should think it's a bad idea, then it's a good idea and we should do it. Or at the very least, we should do it just to make them mad, to show them that we can. And that's a big part of this article. And another one I'm going to share with you, which may or may not have come to me from Greg. We'll just let Greg run the show today. All right. This seems like such a bad idea for the nation and for the president that I have a hard time believing it is a live possibility, says Jack. I hope it is no more than wishful thinking or encouragement on the part of Trump allies. Perhaps it is a giant troll. As I write this, there is no way to tell. Nonetheless, in the hope that this proves to be an irrelevant exercise, I sketch below what I think would happen if Trump did, in fact, decide he wanted Mueller gone. There are legal issues as well as non-legal ones, which I consider in turn. And then he notes for us, this post was written quickly. I will adjust it if necessary as others weigh in. Can I weigh in on typos? I'll try and correct those as I read. All right, first up, legal issues. Mueller was hired pursuant to a special set of Department of Justice regulations. So this is the part of the show where we give you the terms and give you the regulations, read them to you in some instances if they're provided to us, and tell you where to find them. Otherwise, what regulations govern the hiring and potential firing of Robert Mueller? 28 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 600.4, that would be 600.4 to 600.10. And yes, that does seem odd. If you're really just talking about, in math, 600.4 is after, ordinarily speaking, 600.1, which is how we would read 600.10. But this is sections, and so what we're talking about is section 600.4, using the point as like part 4, and then 600.10. So it runs 600.1 through 600 point whatever, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. They're not decimals. But there you are. Code of Federal Regulations, 28 CFR section 600.4 is where we begin. Rosenstein explicitly stated, and we're talking about the Deputy Attorney General here acting for the Attorney General because he's supposedly recused from the case, Rod Rosenstein, explicitly stated that the regulations, just cited, apply to Mueller's appointment. So you don't have to have any doubt about whether or not that's the governing regulation. It is. These regulations were drafted at the end of Bill Clinton's second term, after Congress let the Independent Counsel Act expire. And you all remember that is the case. The Independent Counsel Act has expired. That's why we're using special counsels these days. And there's a little bit of background information in this piece to explain it. But, these are not new regulations. They weren't promulgated by Donald Trump or Donald Trump's Department of Justice. They were pre-existing and came from the end of Bill Clinton's second terms. As Neil Katyal explained in a recent Washington Post op-ed, herein linked, that statute was perceived as problematic, the Independent Counsel Act, because the independent counsel's independence also led him to be less accountable to the public and to regular checks and balances. That's the downside of complete independence. And it's a balancing act. You got to look for the right mix. As Katyal recounts, the new regulations were drafted by an internal Justice Department working group convened by Attorney General Janet Reno and formally promulgated by Reno in 1999. By design, the regulations curb the special counsel's independence, but in narrow respects offer the special counsel some protective insulation. The critical provision on both points is Section 600.7. On the one hand, this provision makes clear that the special counsel is subject to all of the, quote, rules, regulations, procedures, practices, and policies of the Department of Justice, unquote, and that the Attorney General may not only compel the special counsel to justify any investigative or prosecutorial step, but also may countermand the special counsel on proposed courses of action so long as he notifies Congress of the conflict. On the other hand, the regulations also provide a measure of protection by setting 3 specific terms for special counsel's removal. So we have, first of all, that the Attorney General can insist that the special counsel remain in compliance with all rules, regulations, procedures, and practices and policies of the Department of Justice, and can countermand any special counsel orders if he notifies Congress of the conflict. And then when it comes to removing the special counsel can only be removed by, 1, by the Attorney General. Why? For misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or for other good cause, pretty broad, including violation of departmental policies. And 3, it has to be done in writing, which must include the specific reason for special counsel's termination. Now, again, note that this is something that the Attorney General can do unless the Attorney General is either dead or incapacitated himself or recused from the case, in which case the next up, the acting Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, for these purposes, we know who it is, of course, Rod Rosenstein, would step in and fulfill this role. The Deputy Attorney General, in place of the Attorney General who's recused, could fire the special counsel for misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, other good cause, including violation of departmental policies, so long as it's done in writing and gives a specific reason for termination. This raises several questions of interpretation, which are interlinked. All law is a question of interpretation and, of course, interlinked as well. The first issue is what supposed misconduct might constitute the basis for Mueller's removal, right? Like at this point, that's what makes discussing it at this point so crazy. He hasn't done anything. He hasn't interviewed any witnesses. All he's done is hire people to prepare for an investigation. On what basis would you be able to find misconduct? Highly questionable. And again, it may just be that they're preparing the groundwork for discussion of whether or not he can be fired. So it's not a total shock to the system, but the minute he does something, oh yeah, well then that's misconduct, and they'll dismiss him for that. Could that be the plan? I don't know. So the first issue, what misconduct might they point to if they were to fire him? The standard for firing special counsel, remember, is misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or for other good cause, including violation of departmental policies. It is hard to see what Mueller has done that would warrant termination under this standard. Trump might claim that Mueller has a conflict of interest because the firm he left represents the Trump family in some matters. But of course, almost all law firms of any stature probably represent the Trump family in some capacity, or the Trump organization, or someone who's suing the Trump organization. So I'm not certain whether that is is the standard that they would be looking at. It's hard to find somebody probably who doesn't have some connection at this point. And by the way, the same might be said for Russia at this point. Russia having turned into, of course, well, now being a functional oligarchy and being intimately tied up in the public-private social and political affairs of everybody of any consequence in Russia, and the whole MO of the Russian crowd being to invest elsewhere and overseas and in multiple capacities and through multiple legal entities. Somebody somewhere is going to be representing a Russian entity somewhere that could be problematic in many ways. Anyway, but so Trump could claim that there's a conflict of interest because of the firm that he left. But the Justice Department's own ethics experts, you'll recall from the beginning of this storyline, ruled that there is no conflict and that Mr. Mueller's participation in the matters assigned to him is appropriate. So perhaps Trump would claim that Mueller has a conflict because Comey and he are friends and brothers in arms. And it's enclosed in quotations and linked. I don't know who said that and in what context, but I think you get the idea. It's pretty clear that Comey and Mueller are familiar with one another and are fans of one another as well. But it is hard to see how this constitutes a conflict in the investigation of the Russia matter, Jack rather rapidly concludes. Maybe Trump will come up with some other reason under the regulation. We shall see. Let's see, I have a note here from Armando. Who challenges Trump's decision to fire Mueller, and where does this challenge get heard? And then is that what Alan Dershowitz asked? It's sort of, then you attribute it. It looks like you're attributing that question to Dershowitz. Well, let's see if that gets answered in here. Second, under the regulation, the decision to terminate lies not with the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, but with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who is the acting Attorney General for purposes of the Russia investigation, right? Okay, we're all clear on that. So in the first instance, presumably, Trump could order Rosenstein to fire Mueller, or Rosenstein. Is that what we're saying these days? I keep forgetting. Trump could order Rosenstein to fire Mueller. Rosenstein would then have to decide whether he believed the reasons Trump gave were adequate under the regulation. If so, he could carry out the order. If not, and if he refused to do it, Trump could fire him. Or he might simply resign in the face of Trump's order, more on which below, says Jack Goldsmith. Okay, let's see. Let me be clear about the question that Armando posed. Who challenges Trump's decision to fire Mueller, and where does the challenge get heard? Yeah, that's a big open question here, too. All right, let's see if we can address that. By the way, Armando, if you feel like we haven't addressed it by the time we reach the end of the article, you can feel free to call in if you have the time. I guess you could call it in the middle of it, too. I can't stop you. Well, I can, but I will refuse to exercise that prerogative. So, back to our article. Third, if Rosenstein resigns, that raises a question of who becomes the acting attorney general. Succession in the department is to a point outlined by statute. Where the attorney general and deputy attorney general are unable, the associate attorney general shall act as attorney general. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, Armando says he can't talk because he has a cold. And that must be powerfully disappointing to you. Sorry to hear it, Armando. Chicken soup, and if it's a really bad cold and you want to know if it's the flu, you know, Greg's advice, tape, I think we've probably upped it. Maybe we have to make it like $100 that you put on the front door, right? I don't think you'd be typing me notes if you had the flu. However, you can always go with the chicken soup and the 10 rocks in your pocket. And take one out each day, have more chicken soup, and by the time you're done with the rocks, the cold will be gone. Is that the old, is that the adage? I can't remember. It's a great story. Good doctor tale. Anyway, so, if Rosenstein gets the boot, the torch passes nominally to the Associate Attorney General, who by statute shall act as Attorney General. Otherwise, the Attorney General may designate the Solicitor General and the Assistant Attorneys General in further order of succession to act as Attorney General. So it's unclear whether it's just automatically the Associate Attorney General. It's also unclear whether we have an Associate Attorney General in this administration, or whether that's the preference, or whether if the Attorney General steps in, he can designate someone else. But if he's recused, there will be some question about whether or not he has the authority to make this designation, since it is, in the immediate sense, going to have a tremendous impact on how this independent or special counsel investigation on Russia is going forward. However, you know, there's the matter of statute. It says that he can designate him, and since it's the acting attorney general, his charge would be much broader than simply administering the Russia investigation. So there's an argument about whether or not the attorney general would be serious, would be seriously questioned in whether or not he alone could designate who might be next in the order of succession. You can see immediately, like I said, how many crazy permutations there can be and how many places there are to fight. But that's the nature of the law in general. All right, so it's possible that the Attorney General may decide to designate the next couple of successors. That means it could go down the line until an Assistant Attorney General did not resign somewhere along the line and instead carried out the President's order. Succession may be further complicated by the fact that after Rosenstein, there are only 2 other confirmed officials in the entire Department of Justice. Associate Attorney General Rachel Brand, who would presumably be next if you simply follow the statute and say, okay, Rosenstein is out. Next up comes Associate Attorney General Rachel Brand. And then next up would be Acting Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division, whose name will be familiar to you, Dana Bonte, who was previously confirmed to be the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. A tad more on this is promised below as well. If the officers after Brand also resign, just putting it out there, then an executive order on DOJ succession recently promulgated by Trump, remember this one? We did talk about it, would control. That's where we became familiar with Dana Bonte's name. So if everybody resigns, everybody they've got, who is a Senate-confirmed official of the Department of Justice, then Trump's recent executive order would control in determining the next orders of succession, in which he named a series of, 2 or 3 U.S. attorneys who would then step in to the shoes of the Attorney General and all of this. So this barely noticed executive order, though we notice it here, pat on the back for us there, would potentially assume great significance if Trump fires Mueller. Yikes. That gives us pause. So that's what we're looking at there. Fourth, there are a number of hard questions about whether Trump could circumvent the regulations, right? What about that? We always consider that possibility. Suppose he just says, F everything. I don't care what the law says. The law is for losers. I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm a strong alpha leader, alpha male, and I just do what I do, and you live with the consequences, right? Well, lots of questions come up from that. What if he ignores or completely abrogates all law and regulation? And how can he do it? There's a number of ways, but supposing he just does it in the first instance and says, I'm firing Mueller. I don't need Rosenstein to do it. I don't need Dana Bonte to do it. I don't need Rachel Brand to do it. I'm the president. Jay Sekulow said I'm a unitary executive. And what that means to people who are into that sort of thing is, of course, the president has the last word on all of this stuff. And there's some constitutional and legal argument for saying things like this. After all, most, if not all of the authority, vested in people who occupy the positions that the statute says should control. It's all executive power on loan, essentially, from it. It all originates with the president, and the president having nominated them to the position that holds the power. That's the unitary executive theory, that everybody who's acting in the executive acts at the behest of the chief executive. That's why he put them in these positions. And though we like to say in our representative democracy, in our republic, that we value the independence of these people, and we do, when you get an autocrat president like Trump, he doesn't. And he instead is more concerned with the fact that they only have the power to make this decision by virtue of my having given it to them. And if I gave it to them, then certainly I can revoke it. I can and I will. So what do we do if he does stuff like that? The argument at bottom, as Goldsmith puts it here, is that all executive power is vested in the president. Law enforcement is at the core of executive power. There is no contrary statutory directive, as in, say, Morrison v. Olson. Those of you who went to law school will recognize. And the special counsel rule is just a regulation promulgated by the executive branch, not a law, and is thus ultimately subject to change or disregard by executive order. That makes a certain amount of sense. On the other hand, there is this important point made in Nixon v. United States concerning Special Prosecutor Jaworski and the regulation then in force, which was, you'll find in the 38 Federal Regulations 30739 in the old taxonomy, which required extraordinary improprieties for his removal. So back in the Nixon days, there was a regulation that said extraordinary improprieties were the only relevant basis for firing of a special prosecutor. And a quote here, from out of the Nixon v. U.S. case: so long as this regulation is extant, it has the force of law. In United States, ex rel Accardi v. Shaughnessy, 347 U.S. 260, case from 1954. Regulations of the Attorney General delegated certain of his discretionary powers to the Board of immigration appeals and required that the board exercise its own discretion in appeals in deportation cases. The court held, in that case then, that so long as the Attorney General's regulations remained operative, he denied himself the authority to exercise the discretion delegated to the board, even though the original authority was his, and he could reassert it by amending the regulations. Further citations offered here, and those of you who are lawyers and need the citations, you can look them up yourself as we link this in our afternoon roundup post. But suffice to say that the contrary argument here is that in a case where in a Supreme Court case where the Attorney General had given his some of his discretionary power as Attorney General to this Board of Immigration Appeals, it wasn't his to just reclaim simply because it had originally stemmed from his own authority. That once he designated it to someone else, that was the end of it, and it wasn't a yo-yo on a string that you could pull back. And then contrary to that, I guess, would be the argument that, well, that's as applies to the Attorney General. The President of the United States isn't the Attorney General. He's someone entirely different. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the United States. The Chief Executive has a much broader mandate, perhaps, than the Attorney General does, and the rules would simply be different for the President. It's an argument, and those who believe in the unitary executive theory very strongly might be very comfortable with that. The rest of us, maybe not so much. I don't know. The Nixon case citation continues. Here, as in Accardi, in the Nixon versus United States case, it is theoretically possible for the Attorney General to amend or revoke the regulation defining the special prosecutor's authority, but he has not done so. So long as this regulation remains in force, the executive branch is bound by it. And indeed, the United States, as the sovereign composed of the three branches, is bound to respect and enforce it. Moreover, the delegation of authority to the special prosecutor in this case is not an ordinary delegation by the Attorney General to a subordinate officer. With the authorization of the President, the acting Attorney General provided in a regulation that the special prosecutor was not to be removed without the consensus of, at that point, and that under that regulation, 8 designated leaders of Congress. So, that's no longer the operative regulation, but it's a pretty good parallel, and we have here Supreme Court precedent standing for the idea that this is not something that can be retrieved like a yo-yo. Once you've designated the authority elsewhere, it remains there so long as the regulation under which that power was delegated remains in force. That's not a huge barrier, though, because, of course, you can do something about that regulation under which the power was designated. You can revoke it. And who can revoke it? The President can revoke it. How? By executive order. So it's not a huge amount of protection. In other words, though, all it really demands is that the President say, I am doing this. This is my doing. I'm going to fire him. I realize that this regulation says I can't. In order to accomplish this legally, I'm going to countermand the regulation that says I can't. And, I mean, it amounts to the same thing. The President simply saying, to hell with all of this. I'm making an executive decision and firing this person. But it gives it it gives us that something extra that we love here on the Kagro in the Morning Show. The procedural, what shall we say? The procedural bona fides here. It says here, the Supreme Court says I can't fire him so long as this regulation remains in place, but they also acknowledge that the President has the power to overturn certainly mere regulation. So I'm going to do that, and then there will be no regulation that says I can't fire this person, and so I will. You want me to jump through this hoop before firing him? Fine. Here I go. Zing, through the hoop. It's not that hard. You just have to stand up and do it. But again, there's every possibility that Trump may say, just to make liberals mad, I'm going to fire the special counsel without rescinding the Justice Department regulation. I'm just going to go straight to the firing part, and you can sue me over it. And let's get tangled up in court, and then I can say these stupid liberals are always suing about stuff instead of doing things and getting things accomplished like businessmen like me. All right, continuing with our article here. Now we're done with the citation to the Nixon case. In the Watergate context, President Nixon never sought to alter or circumvent the relevant regulations. See, right? He just went straight to the firing part. And thus, they remained in force and binding, at least according to the courts. And as we know, we were eventually rid of Nixon. So would firing Mueller directly simply put Trump into Nixon's shoes here? Yeah. But what if he doesn't give a damn? That's the next question. What if Trump issued or I guess I should say the very next thing that's being addressed here is, what if Trump either pretends to give a damn that that's what sunk Nixon, or is simply advised, look, you don't understand this, but this is the way you got to do it. You want to fire Mueller? I can do it for you. Sign this paper. And the paper says, we'll do it by the book. What if Trump issued a directive that fires Mueller and abrogates or ignores the special counsel regulations, including the authority to appoint and terminate, and the limiting criteria for determination? What if he simply says, F it, just like Nixon? Well, there are good constitutional arguments, herein linked, that support this possibility. There's also the countervailing arguments grounded in the principle that only the agency head that appoints the officer, and not the president, can remove the officer. So there's a couple of problems here. Now, one could be, again, you see how this spins out of control. If Bannon, for instance, knew anything about the law and how it worked, he could simply say, trust me, sign this, and then sign this. And the firing you want is done, and we'll be approaching it on ground different, arguably, from Nixon's ground. Here is an executive order rescinding the Department of Justice regulation that says that the special counsel can only be fired by the Attorney General or acting Attorney General. With that out of the way, then there's legal room for you to sign this, which is his firing. And that'll put us on different footing from Nixon, although it doesn't get us out of non-legal trouble. It clears the way for us to do this legally, but then we have a gigantic political hurdle to clear. But what if you just say, I don't really care whether I'm on different footing from Nixon. Nixon was right the whole time anyway. We certainly know that there are people out there who wanted to relitigate Watergate forever. This would give you the opportunity to do that. And there are even constitutional arguments that say it might work. It's the same people who said, let's relitigate Watergate because I think I can make a constitutional argument that works. They couldn't stomach making it at the time, or they couldn't come up with them, or there wasn't enough political support to bring them to the fore to make those arguments. They just wanted to be rid of Nixon. But it was a different time and a different situation. He didn't have a Republican majority in the House the way they do now. So, he might be emboldened to do things differently. And as he mentions here, there are also countervailing arguments grounded in the principle that only the agency head that appoints the officer and not the president can remove the officer. What do you do with that? This principle is reflected in the regulation itself and is consistent with Nixon's approach to the special prosecutor in Watergate. How these arguments will play out is, as Jack writes here, beyond my scope at the moment and depends in part on the statute, if any, pursuant to which the special counsel regulations were promulgated. See how complicated this could get, right? Essentially, you say, well, okay, what controls right now who can fire the special counsel is the DOJ regulations. And as we mentioned, the president can rescind those regulations. But then you have the next question, which is those regulations. Why were they issued? In other words, under what authority were they issued? Is there statutory authority somewhere that says that the Department of Justice can issue these kinds of regulations? Certainly, there is. It may simply be the generalized authorizing statute for the Department of Justice, period, that from time to time, as necessary for the proper functioning of the department, the attorney general or acting attorney general, as the case may be, may promulgate such regulations as may be necessary to whatever, for the day-to-day operations of the department. Does that change anything? Well, if we knew the exact wording of it, we could look into it. But here, again, the permutations have become so convoluted that even Jack Goldsmith is unwilling to chase this particular rabbit hole, because there's more to get to that's more likely to come up and more relevant that he wants to move on to. And we'll indulge him in that, even though I love chasing things down rabbit holes. So, he says, I'll leave it to others to sort that part out, but raise this one final question. If Trump goes, if Trump goes, what is this? Okay, a little typo. If Trump goes and tries to blow through the regulation and fire Mueller himself, would the Department of Justice or Mueller accept this termination, or instead challenge and litigate the purported removal? That litigation would be interesting. And I think that's the part that begins to address Armando's question that he borrowed from Alan Dershowitz. Who challenges Trump's decision to fire Mueller, and where does this challenge get heard? And the only answer we get from this is, that would be interesting. And, the answer is, I don't know. My guess is that Dershowitz's guess would be the same, that initially you would see either Mueller or I don't know who, Rosenstein. If Rosenstein doesn't immediately resign, might he stay on, or might he simply just say, Mueller's going to take care of this? Can either of them sue to what? Like get a restraining order preventing the president from firing him, or simply challenge the legality or constitutionality of the firing? I suppose if there's a certain claim, certainly on the surface there's the claim, if Trump just goes straight to the firing, then theoretically Mueller, anybody can file the suit. Mueller can file suit and say, the courts should reinstate me or refuse to recognize the firing because, as we know from Nixon v. U.S., that so long as these regulations remain in place, only the Attorney General or Acting Attorney General can fire me. The President isn't the Attorney General or the Acting Attorney General. Yes, they derive their authority from him, but he's not them. And the regulation says that they're the only ones who can do it, and he has refused to rescind those regulations, which is a simple enough step, and one outlined in Nixon v. U.S., and if he refuses to do it, then he's refusing to put himself in compliance with a very simple a demand laid down by the Supreme Court as to how something like this needs to be done, and he's refused to do it. And, a court might be willing to say that because the precedent exists, and that's a very simple thing. They, of course, depending on who draws the case, they might be argued into saying, I can't decide this is a political question, in which case we shift to an entirely different venue, and the question then becomes one for Congress in the impeachment context. That's another problem, and I think that's the one that Dershowitz was hinting at, that the courts wouldn't really be able to solve this one. But, I don't think that the courts would have tremendous difficulty in their first instance with saying Nixon v. U.S. is Supreme Court precedent. I'm totally happy with that. You gotta rescind the regulations first before you fire him. That might motivate Trump to take that route, just to see if he can continue to drag things out. If he refused again and simply said, no, unitary executive, I get to do it, all the powers are derived from me, all powers certainly that the acting attorney general has are derived from the president, and it's just as good, and it should be understood that I've impliedly rescinded these regulations And I shouldn't need to simply sign another piece of paper. The substance of it ought to be enough. Forget the form, focus on the substance. Somebody might buy that. I don't know. So that's all we can do in terms of answering the Dershowitz question. What about other non-legal issues that might arise from the firing of Mueller? A number of hard non-legal decisions must be made within this basic legal framework. Jack writes here, I assume in what follows that the president will not ignore or kill the regulations and fire Mueller himself. The possibility floated above. If that happens, all bets are off about what happens next. But I would predict massive resignations within the DOJ and White House, among other places, if he does that. And I don't know if I go along with that, but when he says massive resignations, I think if we define that to mean the resignations of a small number of highly important people, that's massive in the news sense. But if he means massive in the sense that the entirety of the White House staff or DOJ staff or enormous swaths of them retire, I'm not so certain how many people resign, though I would not, I wouldn't predict otherwise with respect to a few very important, highly placed individuals, although I don't know how many White House resignations there would be. Anyway, first, as noted above, what should Rod Rosenstein do if Trump orders him to fire Mueller? It is a matter of Rosenstein's judgment about whether he is convinced by Trump's reasons for the firing, if Trump even bothers to give any. That's another of our little problems and a little wrinkle to iron out. The regulations say that if he's got a specific reason, and it's one of those listed, and of course he's got the broad umbrella of good cause, but he may have no understanding of what good cause means. It depends on what he's being counseled here. Or he may be being counseled by a non-lawyer, someone like Bannon or Stephen Miller, who might say, we're purposefully looking to confound the law and order types on this. Let's fire him and specifically not give a reason. You may have reasons, but let's not give them and see if that's enough. And if the court says you'd be allowed to do it, let's see if we can get them to say you'd be allowed to do it if you gave a reason, but you didn't give a reason, so therefore you're not. And see if you can cure that defect by giving a reason and stretch this out even further. And it makes you look like you're operating in good faith and accepting the authority of the courts, even though you're really not, because if you did, you would just do what they asked at the outset. You get what I mean here? All right. So what's happening here? Rosenstein will be forced to confront the question of whether or not he agrees that the president has the authority to do this without following the regulation, or even if he does follow the regulation, is he giving good reasons, or is he making reasons up, or does he just misunderstand the reasons and is asking me, Rod Rosenstein, to fire Robert Mueller just because, even though he came up with some bogus stuff on paper about what his reasoning is. Okay? So the question is whether or not he's convinced by Trump's reasons for the firing. Also, he has to confront his own relationship to the president and his view of the president's prerogatives in this situation, about how he characterizes the overall situation he finds himself in, about the actions he is or isn't willing to associate himself with, and about what his sense of integrity demands. These are all the non-legal questions Rosenstein will face. At least two factors lead me, Jack Goldsmith, to think Rosenstein will resign. One, he has already seen his reputation soiled and his judgment questioned by the manner in which the president used his memorandum as a pretext for firing Comey. And two, he appointed Mueller to great bipartisan acclaim, including from Newt Gingrich, thank you very much, and he presumably did due diligence and convinced himself that Mueller was fit to serve. Unless Trump comes up with a clinching reason for firing Mueller that is now hard to fathom, it is hard to see how Rosenstein carries out the order. He will resign. That's Goldsmith's supposition here. Second, what happens as Trump moves down the line of succession? Newly confirmed Associate Attorney General Rachel Brand would be next. And then, I think, would come acting Associate Attorney General for the National Security Division, Dana Boente, who is not confirmed for that job, but who has been Senate confirmed as a U.S. Attorney. What a spot these two would be in. Would they carry out the president's order or resign? It might seem obvious that they would resign because they would not want to carry out or associate themselves with what Rosenstein would have thought, by hypothesis, was a bad faith or at least unacceptable order by the president. I guess maybe easier to imagine for Rachel Brand. Question mark for Dana Boente. I mean, I don't mean to impugn the guy's integrity without knowing anything about him, but he was pretty quick to step in and accept this role that Trump wanted him to take on, and there was nothing necessarily dirty about the role. But accepting a commission from Donald Trump is sullying in itself these days. But, you know, he's an ambitious Department of Justice employee and moving up the ranks and getting to a really senior spot, and he hasn't been asked to do anything terrible yet. So maybe, you know, he'll go, who knows whether he'll go along with it or not. Anyway, his guess, Jack Goldsmith's guess, is that both of them end up resigning. I think that's what would happen, but at some point down the chain of command, a countervailing principle, call it the Bork principle, arises. That is, at some point does somebody in the chain of command claim, anyway, to value stability in the Justice Department and in law enforcement, more generally, higher than safeguarding their own reputation, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the idea that Bork selflessly decided to sacrifice his reputation in the name of stability in the Justice Department and continuing operations at the Justice Department. If everybody resigns, then we don't have a Department of Justice, and that's also a terrible thing. Meh. Okay. The decision by Brand or Boente to execute the president's order or resign would also be complicated by at least two unusual factors. One, unlike in Watergate, Attorney General Sessions remains in place above them and could ensure, outside of the Russia investigation, if he's really recused, that the department continued to function, assuming Sessions himself does not resign in all this, and there's very little reason to believe he would resign over the firing of someone like Mueller. So the excuse of continuity and stability in the Justice Department is somewhat removed from all of this. In other words, if it got down the line to where the next in line of succession finally says, maybe I'm the point at which I need to stand up for the stability of the Justice Department and sacrifice my own reputation. It's an interesting choice, but it's not, if you're basing it on the historical example of Watergate, there's that big problem. No, there is an Attorney General of the United States. That should be stability enough. He can't deal with the Russia investigation, but there's also plenty of other things. This is solely about the Russia investigation. Everything else is taken care of. So it's a weak excuse at this point. The second complicating factor that is rather unusual here, amazingly, DOJ has no other Senate-confirmed officials. And there are complex questions about the line of succession after Brand and Boente for non-confirmed DOJ officials, and about the operation of the new Trump executive order, and whether there is discretion on this matter and who can exercise it. Again, now too much of a rabbit hole. It's easy to imagine Brand resigning, and perhaps Boente after her. It is also easy to imagine that one or the other carries out the president's order on the Bork principle, but at the same time announces that he or she plans very quickly to appoint a new special counsel of undoubted integrity to continue Mueller's investigation. What about that possibility? Well, Jack says, I'll ignore for now because these hypotheticals are getting depressing and complicated. What happens if Trump fires Brand or Boente for appointing a new special counsel? But that's also another outcome that's possible, right? I'll fire the special counsel because I'm convinced Trump's reasons are good ones. Let's say he goes with the conflict of interest thing. Yes, the department initially said that there was no conflict of interest, but we have new information that indicates that there really should be, we should consider there to be a conflict of interest. And so As much as we admire Mr. Mueller, we're going to part ways and start over with somebody else who's even further above reproach on these things. And then Trump says, you know what, that person sucks too, and I'll fire you for hiring a new special counsel. That wouldn't look too bad for Trump, like he's hiding anything, right? But put nothing past Trump. He may very well do that. How do we contemplate what happens then? We're definitely in all bets are off territory by that point, or earlier than that. But at that point, then it's like, well, Congress, do you care that it's a dictatorship at this point, or do you really want a lower tax bill that much? You really want to save a couple of bucks on your taxes? Why? Well, it's small government with a dictator at the top. Would they swallow that? I don't know, man. They're not very smart people. They might. Third, that's what he was just getting to. What does Congress do? That is obviously the really important question. There is no doubt that firing Mueller would cause a backlash in Congress. The question is, how much of one? And specifically, would it be enough to cause Republican leadership to intervene strongly with the president and ultimately with impeachment? The answer depends on the reasons Trump gives for firing Mueller, the manner in which he does it, the precise reaction in DOJ, and what the nation's reaction is. Further, I guess you could ask, what's the reaction if Trump gives reasons for firing Mueller, and what about those reasons, and what are they, and how do people take them? And what about if he fires Bonte or Brand for hiring a second replacement for Mueller, and what's the reaction to that? I got to imagine that the public reaction is, oh my God, he's so incredibly corrupt and so dictatorial, we must be rid of him. And the reaction in Congress is, this makes me feel like I don't want to go home for August recess, so maybe I won't. And listen, once we get our tax cuts solidified, we'll consider what to do about it later if he doesn't become more popular from this. If he doesn't somehow find a polling bounce. And there's no reason to believe that he would. It's just, the Republicans in Congress want what they want, and they're not clear on how this could end their careers. And some of them don't care. I don't care what career path I take. In fact, better, now that I've locked in huge tax cuts for the rich, why do I want to stay here and earn only $170,000 a year? To you and me, that's tremendous money. It's fantastic. I love it. But why limit myself to $175,000 a year if the effective tax rate on the wealthiest people, the highest earners, whether it's earned income or passive income in this country, is lower than anybody else's? Why don't I want to be making $1 million a year, $10 million a year? That's where I want to be. I hope I get thrown out of Congress. Well, then, what can I tell you? We're all flushed down the toilet at that point. How do you contemplate that? Yeah, you spit it out and say, oh, well, and it was a nice run for the Republic while it lasted. So, the answer on how they react depends on all of those sorts of factors. If Congress does not check the president, and that leaves only the midterm or presidential elections, or possibly the 25th Amendment, or whatever, as ways to stand up to the president. That may seem a depressing conclusion, and it is, but I also predict that it would not come to that. Hooray! We're saved. He predicts it won't come to that. If the crazy scenario that got me to this point in the hypothetical decision chain materializes, Congress, he believes, would rise up quickly to stop the president, and the pressure on the cabinet would be enormous as well. If I am naive in thinking this, then we are indeed in trouble. And yeah, so I don't know if that conclusion was as strong in your mind as it was in his when he wrote it. Because if you're with me here, you are naive in thinking this, and we are indeed in trouble. Well, what can I tell you? At least he acknowledged it, and it gave us an opportunity to discuss it. And we'll be the smartest people in the re-education camps. People will there'll be the most work to do on us. We'll be there the longest. We'll break records. This is obviously a record-setting individual. Somebody who needed more re-education than the rest of them. We're, like I said, the smartest people on the cocktail circuit / re-education camp. We saw it coming. And then it came. So what was the point of seeing it? To look like you saw it. That, unfortunately, may be the end. All right, this show is over. We're never broadcasting again. How depressing is that? Well, a little bit. But I think we'll be okay from here going forward. But you're going to sound great this weekend. All right, let's see. Let's catch up and see whether there were any comments that we need to figure out here. Let's see. We have... we'll go to the regular notifications first and then to those of you smart enough to use the KITM hashtag to make these things stick around a little bit longer. We have Jerry Rockwell here on Twitter saying, is this an actual possibility? Sounds like a bit of a stretch, but maybe not. This would be the reference to Adam Schiff's insistence that if the president fired Mueller, Congress would immediately reestablish the independent counsel and appoint Bob Mueller to that job. Don't waste our time. Is it an actual possibility? It's a possibility, but it is not a very good one. Mad Hatter, I think, is in agreement here, noting that was a weak conclusion. This Congress is useless. Yeah, at some point he just needed to cut off the article and publish, and I imagine that the next couple days will be contemplating the possibility that he's wrong about that, but he would have been wrong about that, but right about the caveats with which he went into the writing, which is you don't have to get that many decisions down the chain here before things spin so far out of control that there's no contemplating it. I mean, well, we've faced the question before, even before Trump. The question's been brought up in the context of George W. Bush's administration. What if the president simply says, to hell with that, I don't care? We never quite got there with W, but it was always lingering, always looming out there as a possibility. We may yet get there with Trump. He seems much more inclined to give in to that sort of thing because he's dumb and he doesn't understand that he's being advised by people with no understanding of the law, unless, of course, and this is the ultimate, this is the argument that this ties in the arguments that Armando has always made about the courts and legal realism and nihilism and all sorts of things that they may be ultimately the most right. They have no legal training, they have no legal understanding, but that's just a set of norms, right? And if they don't understand how it works, that's not how it works. Well, that's not how it works if you stick to the norms. But if you actually value and have been laying the groundwork necessary to celebrate the flouting of norms as the new freedom for your base anyway, right? It works with them. Who cares what all these stuffy conservative type establishment folks say? They say it's not how it works. We say it is. Try and stop me. Might makes right. Or at least my willingness to say I'm right makes me right. And ultimately, if the only things standing in my way are court orders, then, the question, once again, we're brought back to the Andrew Jackson thing. How many divisions, right? Or that's actually Stalin, but the court has had it say, let them enforce it. That would be the Jackson. It's the same, it's another iteration of the same principle. I don't recognize their authority. And the question is, how far will the tea and crumpets set go before they say, fine, and we're not genteel, refined, norms defending establishment types. We are revolutionaries and we will have our way and kill you. Which, I guess at the point at which we mow them down, they say, point has been made. I've turned you into revolutionaries. I am, in fact, the victor here. Well, okay. If you want to die that way, that's fine. I'll make it your epitaph. You see, things all come around to the same point eventually. And have we ultimately lost by turning ourselves into the monsters that they wanted to become? No, because they're dead and we're not, and we can reverse course. That's the answer. Does that make you feel comfortable? I don't know if it makes any comfortable with the idea of having to take up arms against the government and admit that all the Second Amendment people were right. But, well, that's just the difficulty of life at this level of constitutional, not quite jurisprudence, but anyway, our constitutional understanding. Okay. Well, that was a huge chunk of the show, but absolutely necessary. And there's more to share with you. Let me go to Pocket because there's 100 things in there that need to be discussed in order to give some context to all this. Like, if all of this seems crazy to you, and it is, why are we having this discussion? What's leading us to the point where we have to contemplate things like this? In no particular order, here are a few things that will make you think about it. One, let's see. I say in no particular order, but that can't be right. I'm going to have to put them in some order. We're limited in our time. I'll have to organize these things on the fly. Ready? Let's begin with Bloomberg News' report here. Russian cyber hacks on the U.S. electoral system far wider than previously known. That's familiar sounding. Of course, it's something that's the way Mark Warner put it early on after the leak of the NSA memo by Reality Winner. We haven't heard from her lately. But let's go ahead and take a look at this one. This is by Michael Riley and Jordan Robertson at Bloomberg. Okay? Looks like also to be on the lookout for auto-playing video here. Russia's cyber attacks on the U.S. electoral system before Donald Trump's election was far more widespread than has been publicly revealed, including incursions into voter databases, we heard about this, and software systems in almost twice as many states as previously reported. That's the news here. In Illinois, investigators found evidence that cyber intruders tried to delete or alter voter data. The hackers accessed software designed to be used by poll workers on Election Day, and in at least one state accessed the campaign finance database. Details of the wave of attacks in the summer and fall of 2016 were provided by three people with direct knowledge of the U.S. investigation into the matter. In all, the Russian hackers hit systems in a total of 39 states, one of them said. So that's the news. We heard about the rest of it, and we also heard the differentiation, and it still stands that there's no evidence at this point of Russia hacking in ways that resulted in the changing of vote tallies and or the way votes were cast. But there's no proof that they didn't get there either. Apparently, we're still at that point where it seems that what we do know tells us that intervening and making changes in vote tallies, at least in the higher stages among the vote counting authorities, the centralized authorities handling this stuff, was theoretically possible because access to their computer systems was possible. But we don't know that anything like that was attempted. Certainly don't know whether anything like that was done. But I have another article that puts that in context too. The scope and sophistication so concerned Obama administration officials that they took an unprecedented step, complaining directly to Moscow over a modern-day red phone, the hotline, that is. In October, two of the people said the White House contacted the Kremlin on the back channel. That would be the legal and authorized back channel established for direct contact between the highest levels of leadership of the United States and Russia, to offer detailed documents of what it said was Russia's role in election meddling, and to warn that attacks like this risked setting off a broader conflict. In other words, a brief reminder that maybe this other piece will also bring to light evidence of immediate meddling in the most basic democratic processes here in the United States by Russia is an act of war. You'd have a war over something like that, presumably. But then again, a war. One of the strange contradictions of the nuclear era is threatening the entire existence of humanity on the entire planet. Makes you wonder every once in a while what is and isn't worth going to war over. I mean, that you would, in theory, obviously, that's an act of war, and you need to punish them severely for it, and war is the answer. But when war means generalized nuclear exchange, or could mean that, is anything worth it? Well, another one of those tough questions. We ask the tough questions here on the Kagro in the Morning Show. Sorry to depress you. You should be listening to this as a podcast today. Or maybe not. Maybe you need the day to recover from it. Okay. So, that happened. The red phone conversation. The new details, buttressed by a classified National Security Agency document recently disclosed by The Intercept, Reality Winners material, show the scope of the alleged hacking that federal investigators are scrutinizing as they look into whether the Trump campaign officials may have colluded in their efforts. And again, that's not proven yet, and it's also not even necessarily necessary. But they also paint a worrisome picture for future elections. The newest portrayal of potentially deep vulnerabilities in the U.S.'s patchwork of voting technologies comes less than a week after former FBI Director James Comey warned Congress that Moscow isn't done meddling. They're coming after America, Comey told the Senate Intelligence Committee investigating Russian interference in the election. They will be back. And this is where they would come back, presumably. A spokeswoman for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington declined to comment on the agency's probe. Russian officials have publicly denied any role in cyber attacks connected to the U.S. elections, including a massive spear phishing effort that compromised Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee, among hundreds of other groups. President Vladimir Putin said in recent comments to reporters that criminals inside the country could have been involved without having been sanctioned by the Russian government. But of course, since the government of Russia is in most senses a criminal enterprise, it's very difficult to really differentiate between the two. Anyway, that's the problem with oligarchy. But that's my comment, not Bloomberg's. One of the mysteries of the 2016 presidential election is why Russian intelligence, after gaining access to state and local systems, didn't try to disrupt the vote. Well, did they, didn't they? This what the other piece I have in store gets to. We'll see how this one handles it. One possibility is that the American warning was effective. That is, the red phone call got them off the case. Another former senior U.S. official who asked for anonymity to discuss the classified U.S. probe into pre-election hacking said a more likely explanation is that several months of hacking failed to give the attackers the access they needed to master America's disparate voting systems spread across more than 7,000 local jurisdictions. Wouldn't that be an interesting kick in the pants? That the reason that the Russians weren't able to hack the vote and simply change the outcome was our patchwork of systems that is so troublesome and so stupid is too dumb to be understood completely in that short amount of time. And the fact that so many different voting systems exist means you have to learn to hack every single one of them in order to do this convincingly, and no one's going to be able to do that. And our idiocy and lack of uniformity, which gives rise to so many other problems, it was what ultimately protected us from that kind of hacking. I don't know whether I buy it, but it's certainly worth contemplating. Such operations need not change votes to be effective, of course. In fact, the Obama administration believed that the Russians were possibly preparing to delete voter registration information or slow vote tallying in order to undermine confidence in the election. It's a slightly different proposition than this other piece that I keep hinting at. That effort went far beyond the carefully timed release of private communications by individuals and parties. One former senior U.S. official expressed concern that the Russians now have 3 years to build on their knowledge of U.S. voting systems before the next presidential election, and there's every reason to believe they will use what they have learned in future attacks. So, for those of us who believe it's impossible for Trump to be reelected, he's terribly unpopular and an idiot to boot, and everyone's beginning to see it, and he's losing his support. Well, that, I guess, is where you would see Russians, if they think his continuance in office is advantageous to them, want to do things like change the vote totals. Maybe. As the first test of a communication system designed to de-escalate cyber conflict between the two countries, the cyber red phone, which is not a phone, in fact, but a secure messaging channel for sending urgent messages and documents, didn't quite work as the White House had hoped. NBC News first reported that the use of the red phone by the White House, first reported that use, I guess. I thought they were going somewhere. That use did something or didn't do something, but they just are reporting the use of this new system. The White House provided evidence gathered on Russia's hacking efforts and reasons why the U.S. considered it dangerously aggressive. Russia responded by asking for more information and providing assurances that it would look into the matter, even as the hacking continued, according to the two people familiar with the response. A very Trumpian response, right? Oh, I'll look into it. Keep doing it. Last year, as we detected intrusions into websites managed by elections officials around the country, the administration worked relentlessly to protect our election infrastructure. Eric Schultz, spokesman for the former President Barack Obama, said, "Given that our election systems are so decentralized, that effort meant working with Democratic and Republican election administrators from all across the country to bolster their cyber defenses." And, I guess now, I don't know if it was hard to imagine then, but even now, it's, I guess it's a little bit easier to imagine. Certain, anyway, Republican officials getting notice from a Democratic president and just saying, fake news, they're trying to, do something to us. Ignore it. Don't take their advice. Illinois, which was among the states that gave the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security almost full access to investigate its systems, a democratically run state, by the way, provides a window into the hackers' successes and failures. In early July 2016, a contractor who works 2 or 3 days a week at the State Board of Elections detected unauthorized data leaving the network, according to Ken Menzel, General Counsel for the Illinois Board of Elections. The hackers had gained access to the state's voter database, which contained information such as names, dates of birth, genders, driver's licenses, and partial social security numbers on 15 million people, half of whom were active voters. As many as 90,000 records were ultimately compromised, but even if the entire database had been deleted, it might not have affected the election, according to Menzel. Counties upload records to the state, not the other way around, and no data moves from the database back to the counties, which runs the elections. The hackers had no way of knowing that was the case when they attacked the state database, Menzel said. And I guess that just comes from a lack of understanding of exactly how the mechanics of these elections authorities work. Nobody here in the United States knows how they work in all of our states either, and very few know exactly how they work mechanically within each individual state. Of course, we probably shouldn't be telling them either, and it's not necessarily all that long before they finally figure it out. The state does, however, at least in Illinois, process online voter registration applications that are sent to the counties for approval, Menzel said, when voters are added to the county rolls. That information is then sent back to the state and added to the central database. This process, which is common across states, does present an opportunity for attackers to manipulate records at their inception. Illinois became patient zero in the government's probe, eventually leading investigators to a hacking pandemic that touched 4 out of every 5 U.S. states. Using evidence from the Illinois computer banks, federal agents were able to develop digital signatures, among them Internet protocol addresses used by the attackers to spot hackers at work. The signatures were then sent through Homeland Security alerts and other means to every state. 37 states reported finding traces of those hackers in various systems, according to one of the people familiar with the probe. In 2 others, Florida and California, those traces were found in systems run by a private contractor managing critical election systems. Guess it didn't really make much difference whether they were private or not. They were all vulnerable. So one strike against the arguments used in favor of privatization anyway. An NSA document reportedly leaked by Reality Winner, the 25-year-old government contract worker arrested last week, identifies the Florida contractor as VR Systems, which makes an electronic voter identification system used by poll workers. In Illinois, investigators also found evidence that the hackers tried but failed to alter or delete some information in the database, an attempt that wasn't previously reported. That suggested more than mere spying missions and potentially a test run for a disruptive attack, according to the people familiar with the continuing U.S. counterintelligence inquiry. I guess what we're hinting at there is, what if massive numbers of people who have been registered to vote forever and vote in every election show up and it's time to cast their ballot and find suddenly that poll workers are telling them you're not registered? What? How can that be? The computer can't be wrong. It's a goddamn computer. well, check again because, well, whatever. And here's a provisional ballot, but we may or may not count that thing later on, depending who even knows what happens to that stuff. That's what they may have been looking to do there. That idea would obsess the Obama White House throughout the summer and fall of 2016, outweighing worries over the DNC hack and private Democratic campaign emails given to WikiLeaks and other outlets, according to one of the people familiar with those conversations. And that would stand to reason too, right? Well, why isn't they speaking out more on the DNC hacking? Well, I think maybe the bigger risk that they were worried about is generalized election mayhem. That would fly with me. The Homeland Security Department dispatched special teams to help states strengthen their cyber defenses, and some states hired private security companies to augment those efforts. Hope they didn't hire Kaspersky, although I have no idea whether Kaspersky is in on this whole thing or not. I hope not, because that's what I use, so I'm an idiot. In many states, the extent of the Russian infiltration remains unclear. The federal government had no direct authority over state election systems, and some states offered limited cooperation. When then DHS Secretary Jed Johnson said last August that the department wanted to declare the systems as national critical infrastructure, a designation that gives the federal government broader powers to intervene, Republicans balked because they hate centralized big government. And they really do. In this case, anyway. Only after the election did the two sides eventually reach a deal to make the designation. Relations with Russia remain strained. The cyber red phone was announced in 2011 as a provision in the country's nuclear risk reduction centers to allow urgent communication to diffuse a possible cyber conflict. In 2008, what started during the Cold War as a teletype messaging system became a secure system for transferring messages and documents over fiber optic lines. After the Obama administration transmitted its documents and Russia asked for more information, the hackers' work continued. According to the leaked NSA document, hackers working for Russian military intelligence were trying to take over the computers of 122 local election officials just days before the November 8th election. While some inside the Obama administration pressed at the time to make the full scope of the Russian activity public, the White House was ultimately unwilling to risk public confidence in the election's integrity, people familiar with those discussions said. And I can sympathize even with that. There's another piece that I told you I have here at the ready, similar in its scope. This one from the Daily Beast. This one puts a finer point on some of these things. We'll see if we can get all the way through it. The Daily Beast, Clint Watts with this one. Russia's last-minute hacking was meant to burn President Hillary. Let's get to this here. Russian hacks sought to undermine Hillary Clinton and cast doubt on the legitimacy of American democracy. Now President Trump is struggling with the validity of his win. It starts this way. Did Russia change my vote? That's the question people, like I said, are supposed to be asking themselves. Monday's leak of a classified NSA document detailing how the Kremlin's military intelligence, the GRU, targeted election officials and breached some voter rolls brought back many Americans' worst post-election fears. Putin changed their vote for Donald Trump, or to a vote for Donald Trump anyway. At the same time, the dumped intelligence report offered some of the best confirmation of Russian meddling in the U.S. election, providing more evidence to tamp down the claims of President Trump and his legions that it was China or a guy in a basement that hacked the Democratic National Committee and many other current and former American officials. The techniques targeting election officials, spam that redirects recipients to false email login pages yielding passwords to Russian hackers, appear eerily familiar to those used by the GRU against many other U.S. targets in 2015 and 16. To the disappointment of Trump's biggest haters, the NSA leak provides no evidence that Russia changed any votes, and that makes sense, as any Russian altering of the tally in favor of their preferred candidate, if he is that, Donald Trump, would be sufficient justification for war. One Russia would lose against the U.S., as is alleged here. If it's a conventional military conflict, yes. Military conflict involving nuclear weapons, who cares? Don't know who wins or loses. You won't be around to figure it out anyway. The Kremlin sought instead to create the perception among Americans that the election may not be authentic in order to push their secondary election effort, undermining the mandate of Hillary Clinton to govern should she win. The NSA report documents cyber espionage operations in August of 2016. Putin's original active measures plan of discrediting Hillary Clinton through strategic leaks of hacked secrets while promoting Donald Trump among American audiences worked to a point throughout the summer. Trump's supporters chanted Kremlin-created or promoted themes regarding Clinton's lost emails, fictitious health problems, and alleged corruption. Despite the success of Russia's hacking-empowered influence efforts, polling showed a Trump campaign destined for defeat after the political party conventions in July of 2016. So much so, the Kremlin sought an alternative second tack to undermine American democracy by sowing chaos and conspiracy. Starting in late summer and growing significantly into the October lead-up to Election Day, the Kremlin's pumping of Trump slowed a bit and was accompanied and outpaced by allegations of, quote, voter fraud, and that the election was, quote, rigged. And by the way, President Trump carried that nicely into the White House with him, insisting several weeks into his administration, and probably still insisting, although no one has asked lately, that he in fact won the popular vote, and everybody would know that if it wasn't for the hacking and meddling and cheating by Democrats, as opposed to that being done on his behalf by the Kremlin. Anyway, back to the Daily Beast here. If Putin couldn't get his preferred choice into the White House, he wanted to discredit Clinton and degrade the authenticity of democracy such that Americans believed their votes didn't count and the Democrats had framed the election. Then candidate Trump echoed these allegations, and that's where the collusion thinking comes from, right? He echoed those allegations repeatedly and so frequently that when he did win in November, his rhetoric in many ways brought doubt to the authenticity of his own victory. To help push along the voter fraud conspiracy, Russia launched hacks in late summer against voter rolls. Not so much voting machines, seeking to shake the confidence of democratic systems and support conspiracies of election manipulation. By the Kremlin's calculations, if Clinton won, Trump's supporters' outrage would then undermine Clinton's mandate to govern, create chaos among political partisans, and might even mobilize anti-government and alternative right groups that saw Trump as their savior. Some will claim Russia might be seeking voter rolls to determine how to influence certain segments of the electorate in favor of Trump, but American social media accounts openly provide far richer data on voter preferences and vulnerabilities for influence. Just ask Jared Kushner, his data analytics wunderkinds, and their partner, Cambridge Analytica. Brings up another interesting topic. Cambridge Analytica's primary backers, Robert and daughter Rebecca Mercer, simultaneously headed a pro-Trump PAC dubbed Make America Number One, not America Makes Number One, which was headed by White House counsel, she's not actually White House counsel, White House advisor, Kellyanne Conway. The PAC doled out $20 million in 2016 and more to Cambridge Analytica than for any other expenditure. So, interesting way of laundering things here. How can we get this $20 million in PAC money to become personal dollars that we can put in our pocket? Launder it through Cambridge Analytica. That's how. Another story. Anyway, Trump White House senior advisor Steve Bannon sat on Cambridge Analytica's board while running operations at Breitbart before becoming Trump's campaign CEO. Russia didn't need to scout voter rolls to influence them for Trump on Facebook. Cambridge Analytica performed that targeting on its own, delivering stories based on hacked materials to Trump voters. In other words, doing the Kremlin's work for them. In other words, collusion with them, even if they didn't know. But that, I guess, I would sow doubt about whether it was really true collusion. But the idea that they didn't have any idea, really, okay, they just happened to be saying the same things. Could be. As I noted in my recent testimony, our writer tells us, to Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Cybersecurity in last October, Russia's active measures cyber playbook works best when paired with provocations, physical actions undertaken by Kremlin agents that provide grains of truth for powering conspiracies. Countries closer to Moscow receive greater volume and intensity in provocation to undermine democracy and power cyber influence. Russia allegedly changed the vote. They actually changed the vote. Where? In Ukraine in 2014. A result narrowly caught and corrected before the final tally. So it's not that they are unable to or unwilling to do such things. They are. They just did it in Ukraine. And I guess we found out a couple weeks ago that it was well within the knowledge of the Republican leadership in Congress at the time that they had done this. But we might get tax cuts. So we ignore it. Remember that? In America, it sought not to alter the tally, but to create the perception that it's possible and instill doubt among Americans in the process, forcing us to ask these hard questions about what if nothing matters after all, LOL. That's why we're here on the show. Hacking of voter rolls rather than machines creates an impression in the voters' psyches without provoking the U.S. into open conflict. In other words, we still came away, many of us actually to this day, with the impression that they changed the vote totals, even though that hasn't been proven. We conflate that in our minds, and they knew that we would do that, and they get the results they wanted without actually changing the tallies, which would push us to say, this is an actual act of war. Now it's we don't know what this is. This is also an act of war. Yes, but we're afraid of the fact that a war might spin out of our control, obviously, as we should be. And so a pretty good excuse for not launching it, among others, like not ending all life as we know it on the planet, is, it didn't really necessarily reach that level. It reached the same, we got the same conclusions out of it, the same results obtained, but they didn't hack this actual little spot over here, so no need for a war. Well, just as well. Any excuse not to have a war, I guess. Corroborating evidence supporting the Kremlin's alternate plan to prepare for undermining a Clinton 2016 victory exists. Our writer here says, I noticed a shift in Kremlin messaging last October when its overt news outlets, conspiratorial partner websites, and covert social media personas pushed theories of widespread voter fraud and hacking. Reuters recently reported that a Kremlin-backed think tank, the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies, drafted in October and distributed in the same way, warned that Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was likely to win the election. For that reason, it argued it was better for Russia to end its pro-Trump propaganda and instead intensify its messaging about voter fraud to undermine the U.S. electoral system's legitimacy and damage Clinton's reputation in an effort to undermine her presidency, Reuters' Ned Parker, Jonathan Landay, and John Walcott wrote. The ex-MI6 agent Chris Steele's dossier echoes these sentiments, noting from pages 28 to 31 that the Russians were having buyer's remorse with Trump and were reorienting their campaigns to achieve their objectives should Clinton win. In total, Russia's active measures sought to destroy faith in democracy even more than it wanted to elect Trump. And there's no better symbol of democracy than to attack than the purity of elections. Purity. Keep that in mind. Americans have the luxury to hear the testimony of Director of National Intelligence Coates, NSA Director Admiral Rogers, and Acting FBI Director McCabe on Wednesday. The recently released document will likely come up during Senate Select Committee questioning. Senator Mark Warner already seems to be suggesting this classified doc is just the tip of Russia's meddling iceberg. For all Americans, I hope we get more answers than questions after the next 2 days' hearings. Well, I hope so too. What other things do we need to include in today's roundup? We're running low on time, as usual, but pretty soon we'll tell you what's coming up next, given what we've skipped on today's show. Coming up next on the after show, here's one more thing to throw into the mix here. Trump's personal lawyer, remember I told you that came up again, and I thought it was Mark Kasowitz. Here's what Kasowitz is actually up to. Trump's personal lawyer boasted that he got Preet Bharara fired. How do you like that? That's ProPublica publishing that piece. Mark Kasowitz, President Trump's lawyer in the Russia investigation, has bragged that he was behind the firing of U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara. That's going to be an interesting development. That's not something I think we can cram into the few minutes that we have left, but I want to put that on your radar. Maybe I can read the lead here. Kasowitz has boasted to friends and colleagues that he played a central role in the firing of Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, according to 4 people familiar with the conversations. Kasowitz told Trump, "This guy is going to get you," according to a person familiar with Kasowitz's account. Those who know him say he is sometimes prone to exaggerating. That's why he's Trump's lawyer. when regaling them with his exploits. But if true, this assertion adds to the mystery surrounding the motive and timing of Bharara's firing. New presidents typically ask U.S. attorneys to resign and have the power to fire them, but Trump asked Bharara to stay when they met in November at Trump Tower. In early March, Trump reversed himself. He asked all remaining U.S. attorneys to resign, including Bharara. So far, Kasowitz hasn't responded to requests for comment on that story, but that just adds more to it. Maybe it's just one of those physical provocations that's supposed to supply seeds for conspiracy theory that we were talking about earlier. So I don't know. We got that to look at. Something else to keep up on, and we're not going to be able to fit this one in, but we'll discuss it. Perhaps, you know what? This is a great opportunity because we're running into this time barrier here, and we have Wednesday away from the show. Maybe what I can do is just carry it straight into a podcast that I record for Wednesday. Bill in Portland, Maine asked yesterday, midway through the show, whether we could update everybody on what's happening with the health care bill. And we can't in substance, because of course you will know by now that the healthcare bill's text is a closely held secret, and that's problematic for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, hey, we'd like to know what your new proposed law is going to do so we can decide whether we like it or not and whether to hold you account for voting for it or not. But we can explain, and maybe that's what we'll do here. We'll carry on with that one, and that way tomorrow we'll have that discussion. We won't be able to have Joan with us anyway, not only because we won't be doing a live show tomorrow thanks to the dentist appointment that we have tomorrow. The refrigerator's fine. Now we're on to the teeth. But as it turns out, Joan is tied up in meetings tomorrow anyway and wouldn't be able to join us. So we can make a congressional and legislative themed podcast for you anyway. Answer that question and make sure that you have that material in mind for the balance of the week. This being a critical week, you will have seen, I'm sure, exhortations from Democratic activists across the board that this is the time to begin calling your members of Congress, your senators, and reiterating your opposition to the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and certainly your opposition to the passage of the American Health Care Act, because, of course, it's horrible and will kill a lot of people. But reminder, by the way, as one of our listeners pointed out in comments on Twitter, do not, if you don't have a Republican senator, call your Democratic senators and reiterate your support for their standing in the way, any way that they can do, because the word is that they may not necessarily go to the mat for in every way possible to obstruct the passage of this thing. But don't call Republican senators from out of state and pretend to be their constituents. It doesn't help anything, and it hurts more than it helps by far. But yeah, if you have Democratic senators, by all means, bolster their resolve. We'll discuss that in the upcoming podcast. What about what's coming up next today, right here on the after show that we may have missed so far? Sandy Hook Promise has dropped Megyn Kelly as the master of ceremonies from this year's benefit. I had no idea that was even the case. Can you imagine that? Over her Alex Jones interview. And you know what? I'll have to include material on that in Wednesday's podcast as well, because Greg has lots on it. Trump's personal New York lawyer brags that he got Preet Bharara fired, or at least we mentioned that one. And Trump supporters' hate of immigrants is at an all-time high, believe it or not, as recent arrivals are more educated than the American citizens of 26 states. No wonder we hate them.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
On the last half of today's after show, they'll be talking with Chris Reeves, a.k.a. Tom Servo 433, for a discussion on the winners and losers of Kansas's tax showdown, another subject we need to address. An anti-immigrant and voter suppression guru, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, announces his candidacy for governor.